Thank you for joining us. We're discussing the intellectual life today. Is the intellectual life too intellectual? That is our question. My name is Jason Paone. I'm the editor of Word on Fire Academic. I'm also a doctoral candidate of theology at the Catholic University of America. Joining me today is Kevin Kambo. He's an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Dallas in Irving. Kevin specializes in classical Greek philosophy, especially Platonic moral psychology. His other scholarly interests include philosophy of technology, philosophy of literature, and liberal education. Grateful to be here with you, Kevin.
Well, thank you.
We're also grateful to the Institute for Human Ecology for hosting this event. The Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America is the nation's leading academic institute committed to identifying the economic, cultural, and social conditions vital for human flourishing. For more information, visit ihe.catholic.edu, and there will be some more information in the chat dialog box. We'll go ahead and get started, and I promise the rest of the discussion will not be this scripted. But before we start, I'll say also that we welcome any questions or comments that you might have. We're hoping that of the millions of participants, we'll get at least a few people talking back and not just passively listening to this webinar. So please, if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A dialog box at the bottom of the screen. Or if you just want to make a comment or, you can also use the chat box. That's fine too. We'll dedicate 15 minutes at the end of the discussion to your comments and questions. And if you want, if you put something in the chat box, if we see it, we might discuss it then and there. So let's go ahead and get started. Our question today is the intellectual life too intellectual? And in order to break that question down and really clarify what we're after here, Kevin, why don't you go ahead and get us started and frame the question for us?
All right. Thank you once again to also everyone who's sort of tuning in, I suppose. And obviously, thank you to IHE and Jason for hosting us this afternoon. This is a bit of a funny question, and in some ways, as a point of confession, we sort of picked the theme before we were 100% sure how we were going to try and unfold it. And unfortunately, we're both potentially intellectuals. I mean, I teach ancient philosophy most of the time, and obviously Jason here is an editor at Word on Fire Academic. So we might be the wrong people in some ways to kind of raise this problem, because no one's really outside of our world kind of looking at the weaknesses that we might have. That being said, we thought, just in the context of things like liberal education and intellectual life more broadly, are the things that are being proposed and kind of celebrated, maybe in some ways too intellectual, by which we mean that there's a kind of anthropological problem in the models that we have. And rather than trying to sort of define intellectual life neatly, or what we mean by intellectual very neatly at the beginning, I thought we'd instead maybe raise maybe 3 models or paradigms, which I'm going to offer. These are not the only ones, I don't think, but I think they're sufficiently common. They're sort of historical in a way, which will allow us to open up the question and kind of see what we're trying to get at. So I will offer 3 paradigms or models of the intellectual life, and kind of raise questions about, are there weaknesses that these have when it comes to understanding, well, is this a good human life? Mm-hmm. So one kind of obvious one, which is more classical, might be the figure of the sage. So this is someone who tends to be a possessor of wisdom, some kind of contemplative figure. One of the things that's really striking to me in a lot of the descriptions of sage-like figures in the classical literature is they tend to be solitary, and also, and therefore, for various reasons, isolated from their communities or from normal work or manual work and things like that. And Plato himself sort of uses the figure of Thales, who famously falls into this well because he's stargazing. And so this is one of the kind of images that goes with the sage figure, his gazing on these eternal, unchanging things with the regular motions. His eyes are so far up into the heavens that he can't see what's at his feet. And Plato's aware of this sort of way of characterizing the sage, and he does actually kind of lean in and be slightly in the Theaetetus to say, yeah, he is a kind of alien figure. And what are we going to think about that, and what are we supposed to do about that when we maybe propose this as something that many people should do? Another kind of image or paradigm would be one that's a bit more monastic, I think. And what I have in mind here is kind of this researcher who's in his cell and is so focused. And the idea here is, the intellectual life is something stern, it's serious, it's maybe ascetic. There are shades here, I think, of the rule of Saint Benedict, where there's not much fun being had, right? No frivolity, maybe even less laughter. If you've read Umberto Eco's Way of the Rose, this is one of those things that kind of comes up towards the end as to, what is the place of laughter in the kind of contemplative life and things like that. But the idea is very serious. And for those of you who saw the graphic, I think, for the event, I remember just looking at the graphic this morning and I thought, that statue looks like a very serious person. This is kind of monastic in a way. And again, is this a good image of the intellectual life? Similarly, there's Rodin's statue, the thinker. And I have no idea why this is, again, in many of our imaginations, become one of those wonderful, useful figures for thinking about this is what the intellectual life looks like. And it troubles me for two reasons. One is that actually the thinker belongs on top of the sculpture of the gates of hell. And so again, are we thinking about this arduous, serious, interior sort of thing? That's kind of slightly probably problematic or troubling. And then maybe more contemporary, so modern, a late modern contemporary figure would be, I think, Jason and I might be counter as the intellectual. So, we had the sage, then we had the monastic, and then we had the intellectual. And this is characterized by the idea of an intellectual worker. This is a person who's, who's writing and he's doing the scholarly thing. A number of times I hear my friends and colleagues sort of maybe criticize or dismiss someone as, so-and-so might not be a serious thinker. And probably the idea is, not quite a real intellectual or something like that. And these people are often seen engaging in intellectual debate, intellectual disputes. And that's sort of what they do. This image, I think, in the more extreme version, there's this sort of intellectual machine, that this person is just so smart, so focused. And again, there's that question of what is the relation of their intellectual life to, say, the rest of your psychology, right? Your passions, your desires, your ambitions, your hopes, and even more interestingly, the rest of your person, so your body, right? So that's kind of one extreme. And then the other extreme is intellectuals are funny beings in that they tend to get possessed by ideas that I think politically, if we think about it, a lot of wacky ideas seem to come from academia. And in Plato's Phaedrus, right, when Plato is talking about, for example, this divine madness that comes upon poets and lovers and prophets and so on and so forth, he thinks it's probably a good thing, but there's a sort of like a perverse and dark side of that to intellectuals where they get sort of consumed and possessed by their ideas. And again, that's not really a great thing. Now, you might ask, okay, we've got the sage, the monastic, the intellectual. Is there something maybe connecting these things, right? That would be a good Socratic question. Is there a form that joins these three paradigms? And I'm going to use something incredibly loose and probably irresponsible. But I think when we look at all of them, there's a sense that the intellectual and the intellectual life is this brainy thing. Okay, so that's the image maybe that we'll go with. Sort of, these are the brains. And the aspect of the sage is that kind of concentration into a kind of interior, and so you're kind of removed from, I don't know, community life or manual life or something like that. With the monastic, there's that sense of intense focus, again, which is sort of, it's brainy. And maybe you can imagine Aristotle, at least the stories of Aristotle that we're told, where he's there doing his writing and he's stretched out his hand and he has a pebble in it and he's writing all night. And if he falls asleep, he will release the pebble, it'll falls into this metal basin and then it'll wake him up and he'll go back and be dedicated to the intellectual life and to research. Like, okay, not so great. And then obviously the intellectual kind of today, again, they seem to be sort of wonky, seem to be nerdy, that kind of thing. And that's sort of what we have in mind, right? Are there ways in which this idea of being brainy is, in various senses, is just too narrow a vision, of intellectual life, and is a kind of sort of anthropological problem to this? One last thing, just sort of kind of tie this in, is the tradition itself, I think, continually sort of lampoons in various ways this figure, this sort of very brainy person. And that's an interesting thing to consider, that, Aristophanes' Clouds makes fun of this thinkery, or this think tank that Socrates seems to be running. Plato's Symposium begins with Apollodorus, who's this, again, clownish sort of sophomore figure who's really into philosophy, super nerdy, and he's attacking this guy who's a merchant. So you have maybe the first recorded moment of a philosopher attacking like a crypto bro or something. And you're like, Plato's aware of this. And then Erasmus goes against the scholastics majorly in Defense of Folly, right, famously. Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels attacks Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. He thinks that because Bacon thinks we should have a society led by intellectuals and by researchers. And Jonathan Swift, one of the chapters of Gulliver's Travels, is precisely to attack this idea of why would we be led by these weird, brainy people? And then obviously C.S. Lewis's Hideous Strength, where, it's basically, if you read it as an academic, you're like, well, yeah, that's my tribe, and we're kind of awful. So that's sort of what we had in mind, right? If we're going to propose the intellectual life as to people as something good, then is there something sort of problematic with the images and paradigms that we have of this life?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the points that we constantly see these philosophers like Aristotle saying that the intellectual life is for everybody.
Yeah.
In the beginning of the Metaphysics, he says that, it's a basic human thing to want to know, to look out at the cosmos and to wonder. Stargazing is something, even children do. It's not this reserved activity for a particular class or cohort of people that are sort of removed from society, removed from community, all alone, practicing this specialized career or skill set. The idea all along, even when the philosophers who have advanced it are presenting it as though it's only for certain people. The idea is that this is an anthropological thesis. It's the intellectual life is just a human thing to do. Now, if it is just a human thing to do, then you're simultaneously saying that everybody should be doing it and almost nobody is.
It's hard to find people who are doing it in a way that is sort of humanly attractive. Maybe it's sort of one of those sort of questions that when we look at the tradition, very often sort of leading thinkers in the tradition, like, there's problems with this thing that we keep proposing as in some ways accessible to many people, if not all people, right? So that maybe that's the Aristotelian line, all men by nature desire to know, or something like that.
Yeah.
But also this thought that it's also this high achievement that maybe not everyone does. And so what are we actually proposing, and why are we proposing this to people? And it's not going to be enough to say something like it's intrinsically good, because that's one of the ways that I think we tend to defend it, those of us at least who are in academia, that it's not about profit, it's not about politics ultimately, it's about these things that are intrinsically good, worth knowing and accessing on their own terms. But that doesn't entirely explain the motivational question from the perspective of a human person, right? What's its relation to the human good? And what kinds of things does a person need to do to sort of do this well, I think.
Yeah, so I think that, I don't know, I feel like we want to say two things.
Yeah.
On one hand, we're going to say that the intellectual life is an aspiration for everybody, not just people who can read, not just the people who have the money to be leisurely and to invest oodles of time into reading long books. It's an aspiration for everybody, but it's also on another level, it's something that everybody is already doing. The intellectual life, it's this fundamental human aspect of human life. We are rational animals, and we have this rational intellectual orientation to the world, even when we're not scholars. So go ahead.
Oh, no. So, and the scholar thing I think is really interesting, because a lot of us maybe today might think that's what it looks like, right? The life of scholarship or something like that. Whereas you're raising up this good question of, well, actually, what would this look like if it's not narrowed so much to this sort of brainy, scholarly sort of thing? What would it look like, for example, for many people to do this? And sort of engage this? And my thought on this is, and I'm going to bandwagon here, and if people who have heard me talked about this already are going to be like, oh, you're being caught out. But one of the things that I did appreciate about Zena Hitz's book, about the hidden pleasure of the intellectual I lost in thought, was that we should be talking a bit more, presumably, about contemplation and how contemplation is in some ways the right end of the intellectual life. And it's something that's accessible to many people at various kinds of, who are doing various kinds of things. And learning to contemplate, even in the middle of the world or even in ordinary life, doesn't require you to, say, have a PhD. It doesn't require you to be this grand scholar. And then that's sort of maybe tying in with that whole Pierre Hadot sort of question of, or his complaint, rather, his critique, that today there's so few philosophers and there's so many professors of philosophy. Because people think, right, to do the intellectual life, you go into academia, this place of research and scholarship and so on. But Hadot is saying, but they're not really doing the real philosophical thing, which is this sort of contemplative appreciation of the world and et cetera, et cetera. So maybe we should ask then, what does it mean for, what is contemplation then? If it's not just this scholarly, erudite, often pedantic, super nerdy kind of thing, how do you maybe spin it, or at least run with this idea?
Yeah, that's great. And the book that Kevin was referencing there is called Philosophy as a Way of Life by Pierre Hadot. Yeah, so one of the questions that I think this leads to when we ask, what is it? So we're sort of asking, what does the intellectual life look like for an ordinary person? And I think if we take a broad historical view, we have to say an ordinary person might not even be able to read. Prior to the 20th century, there's abysmal literacy rate, something like 5% of the population to read. But it's natural to think that the intellectual life has something to do with reading, but does it?
Huh. Oh, that's great. We'll circle back to the reading thing, because at least I feel like, given both our offices right now, we probably have to be partisans when it comes to reading. But I've got lots of pictures too, so love of sights and sounds. But the question of contemplation seems to be often viewed or characterized in paradigms of vision. So this goes, you can see this clearly in Plato and the Republic and so on, for example, or the Phaedrus. That Plato likes the paradigm of vision because this is clearly a way in which we're taking in the world. And maybe an easy accessibility way of talking about contemplation that is actually not literary or literate, at least at the outset, is a kind of learning thoughtful attention or thoughtful attending and seeing in the world. And I've been, I think, influenced a lot on this point by Iris Murdoch, who's this sort of 20th century Platonist, let's say, Anglican atheist Platonist. And she has this fascinating reflection on the importance of learning to attend, learning to sort of see what's actually there in a way that's not thoughtless. And I think a lot of us sort of go through life in this way in which we are not quite attentive to what we're seeing or even to what we're saying. And this happens all the time. And just to kind of give a concrete example, which actually will be relevant, I think, to the question about scholarship in academia as well, is just the amount of cliches that we use in conversation and in writing. These are obviously ways in which you see inattentiveness, right? And so, I mean, I teach undergrads, so I'm continually reading all the time, someone saying something along the lines of blah, 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 Plato says this, and this begs the question that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, question mark. And that is clearly, not what begs the question means, but there's this sense that there's this intellectual way of talking. And so there are certain phrases or formulas you just sort of deploy, and you kind of feel good using them because you're like, oh, you look at me, I'm using smart language. And often if you're with people similarly in that zone of ignorance, they kind of nod along because they're pleased that they too sort of understand this deep thing that you're saying. But that's a misuse of the term, is that you actually do not know what you're saying. Similarly, something like, this is a much more basic one, is when people talk about, the proof is in the pudding, right? That is a kind of nonsense phrase at a certain level, because the real expression is the proof of the pudding is in the tasting. But we just say the proof is in the pudding, the proof is in the pudding. And we're like, yeah, that's so right. Way to can deploy that nugget of insight and depth. But it shows you that these cliches are a kind of grease that you just kind of slide down them, and you're not really thinking. In a way, your thoughts have been prepackaged into these nice images and phrases, and you just have to kind of employ them, and you kind of feel smart about doing this, and people around you kind of nod along. But you're not being thoughtful. You're not attending to what you're saying. You're not attending to what you're seeing, because if you actually were attending, you'd actually realize that expression doesn't quite make sense. And one of the nice things, at least I think, about good poetry and good literature is it has way more kind of arresting formulations, because they do make you stop and actually say, oh, that was a nice combination there, which allows me to think about things in a different way or see things in a different way. So maybe this sort of idea of thoughtfulness versus thoughtlessness, which is something I think people as human beings could use a lot more of. Mm-hmm. And it's obviously an intellectual act, right? This sort of capacity to sort of thoughtfully attend to what's there. So sort of this Murdochian kind of notion, I think, is one way of thinking about this attentiveness, thoughtfulness, and what does that mean for, as it were, ordinary people? Because quite frankly, scholars and academics are ordinary people, and they too use cliches and jargon all the time. So it's not that intellectual often in the sort of virtuous sense.
As an editor, I can tell you that we get so many manuscripts that where an author is writing kind of unconsciously to a particular audience.
Yep. And
taking in all these presuppositions that are not being interrogated, using all of these kinds of, cliches of the guild. And I think that in general, it's a temptation that every field, no matter what you do, I think there is a temptation to be superficial in your engagement with the world. The word in the artistic domain that corresponds to the cliche is probably the kitsch. Kitsch art is just very accessible. It's familiar. Yep. You know it so well that you don't need to try to know it. Mm-hmm. And in a way, you don't know it. You just sort of assume that you do. It's the kind of material that doesn't require any engagement on your part, doesn't require you to really struggle to understand something, to appreciate something, to grasp it. And I think that internet culture, we're sort of bombarded with information all of the time that we're used to, as consumers of this information, we're used to just ignoring most of it, filtering it all out, filtering. We're better at not paying attention to things, I think, than we are at paying attention to things. And then as creators of let's say, internet content, we're always trying to find ways to package our information so that we require as little effort from our reader or our consumer as possible. We package it like some kind of, happy meal. It's a standard trope that you've seen before, so you don't have to think about it. Oh, yes, that. Oh, yes, that. Oh, yes, that. And so you're just acknowledging and recognizing without really engaging with things. So I think that that's the sort of model that shows how ordinary people can engage in the intellectual life, and I guess in this case it's by just sort of really in paying attention and actually being present and really seeing the mystery in things, and not just presuming that you understand it too quickly, but it also shows, so it shows how there's an aspiration, but it also shows the ways in which we often do and probably most of the time do fail to be living the intellectual life and in the many ways that you can live the intellectual life.
Yeah, I like that because especially sort of this idea of the kitsch angle, because one of the things that I think we're trying to maybe escape, if we can talk about escape in a positive sense, sort of kind of escape to freedom, in the Platonic kind of picture, you want to sort of shake people up, and this is maybe something in the Phaedrus, right? You want to sort of have them struck by something, right? And they exactly the aporia, sort of Socratic interrogation, also is a way of sort of shaking people up from realizing that you've sort of been just repeating certain acquisitive cycles in a way, because the kitsch is kind of easily collectible. The cliches are a way of collecting also, like sort of, but you're collecting mental furniture that's not really that you've made, and you sort of use it and deploy it as if it's yours. And these things have a way of, again, yeah, making us distracted and less attentive. And Plato's question is right. Socrates, when he interrogates, is trying to kind of interrupt that sort of conveyor belt. You just sort of continually find yourself on and say, what is actually going on? What am I actually saying? And by kind of achieving that interruption, that aporia, you therefore make people turn and try and actually look at what is actually there. And as you were saying with the kind of social media thing, there's this feeling that when we go out into the world, especially these days, so much of it has been prepackaged, that you've been told, for example, that if you're going to go visit this city, here's the guidebook, and here are the sort of things you need to hit as if you're in an RPG. These are your quests. Take a picture of yourself here and a picture of yourself there, and so on and so forth. And Joseph Pieper, in some essay whose name I forget, but I think it's something along the lines of learning to see again. He says, it's just kind of wild how when people go into a city, their heads are in the books, right? And they're like, okay, what should we do today? Let's look at the book. And then you go to some destination, maybe you put the book, and then the destination tells you, or sort of the book tells you, in this destination, this is what to look at, and this is what to do. And people kind of think this is a little ridiculous because they're just being herded through life. Even though they think they're participating in culture, even though they think they are doing something, I don't know, literary or artistic or whatever, they're actually still just being moved around this belt, right? Because the guidebook is a manifestation of focus groups and deliverables and that life of packaging and collecting and acquiring and producing for easy consumption. Whereas people think, how about you just walk through the city? Sure, you can have some things you want to hit, but if you actually are walking through the city curious about it, you'll see way more interesting things and they will raise questions in your soul. The guidebook person doesn't really have questions. He has, places to go and achievements to sort of acquire or something. And again, yeah, so just sort of that's part of having an intellectual life that's not about being, brainy, but it's about learning to see your community again and to see it properly, hopefully, and learning to see your city well and see it again as it fresh and new and stuff like that.
Great. Yeah, I think the idea that the intellectual life is about having a question, not just assuming that you already know everything. You sort of approach things and give them the attention that their newness and their profound mystery and strangeness demands. I feel like the travel thing is interesting because whatever Joseph Pieper was talking about in that essay, it has to have only gotten worse with the social media. We don't really take vacations. We just document our own vacations. We sort of experience our own vacation through our social media page or whatever. But yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions here. Do you want to turn to questions?
Sure, let's do that.
Okay, so Sarah Thomas has asked, interested in the role of love in the intellectual life, not just the erotic lure of knowledge, but how knowledge might extend to love of neighbor. Paul Heck has made the case that the purpose of universities is to provide us with the knowledge to love. Where do you see the role of love in the intellectual life? Great question.
Okay, this is what you get for doing live theater. Quest the role of love in the intellectual life, and not just about the love for wisdom, I suppose, or something like that. Okay, so let's see if we can kind of make up something. So one interesting paradigm I like, which oddly enough, because Plato's allegedly this guy who's into, hating the demos, and you're supposed to leave the cave and ideally never return into the cave. But one of the things that the Republic asks at 2 points is the sage figure. So when he's contemplating the things that are the highest, let's say the forms or whatever they are, what is being done to him? And there's sort of two paradigms, and they're actually, I think, in tension with each other. So earlier on in the Republic, and I unfortunately am not a good enough scholar to just tell you, oh, this is obviously book 5, but Plato says contemplating the forms, or rather Socrates says contemplating the forms makes you more like the forms. So the basic idea here is, and that's given to us as a good thing. So the idea is the thing that you attend to, the thing that you sort of give your attention to, you will conform to it, and therefore you will be shaped by it.
Right.
And one neat and slightly troubling example is actually in Zena's book, Zena Hitz's book, which is this guy who just loves the falcons, right? And he's following them all over the place, and he's attending to the falcons in this major and wonderful way. But as it turns out, at least as Zena narrates it in the book, the guy starts taking on raptor tendencies, predatory tendencies of a sort. And every time, when I read that in the book, I thought, oh yeah, this is interesting. So is Zena proposing this as a good form of the intellectual life or not? Because this sounds like this guy is actually being deformed by this deep love and pursuit and attending to the falcons. But later on in the Republic, Socrates changes tack and brings up not the idea of conforming to the forms directly, but introduces a sort of mediating figure, which is the demiurge, which is some kind of godlike figure. And he says, well, actually, the goal of the philosophical life is to approximate as best as you can the life of the demiurge. And the demiurge does two sorts of things at the same time. On the one hand, he is contemplating the eternal thing, so he's contemplating, eternal truth. But he is also performing what we might call providential ordering of the world that's around him. And that's part of his task as this sort of divine figure. And we're supposed to imitate the demiurge. So yes, there's the contemplative sort of aspect, but then there's, as it were, this active life aspect where you have custody and care for what is all around you. So you can't actually, therefore, just leave the political or leave the communal or something like that. But instead, you have to return into the cave, as Socrates wants to say. So kind of to maybe broaden this out correctly with the question of love, Plato thinks that everything that there is has a kind of kinship. They all have kinship under the good, which explains partly the demiurge's action, that he has concern not just for himself and his contemplation, but he has concern for, as it were, realizing the good throughout the whole cosmos. And for us, then I think the intellectual life, and now I am going to go against John Henry Newman. So if I'm about to say something disturbing, then just know that even Newman makes mistakes. But Newman in Discourse 5 of Idea University says that there's the kind of Discourse 5, he's like, knowledge is its own end, blah, blah, blah. And then the last 4 pages, he's trying to say, and it's not about forming the heart. It's not about forming your affections. None of that stuff. That language is clearly wild and just disturbing from a Platonic Augustinian sort of perspective. Because I would say that for Plato and Augustine, the demiurge sort of has a custody of peace, that you're Your contemplation of the true things moves you to care about the good of other things. You don't care about them in an acquisitive mode. So that's sort of like the lowest appetitive consumption kind of mode, where you just want to collect and control and consume. So that's not the kind of love that you have for things. Secondly, you don't care about them in a kind of thumotic competitive mode. So they're just ways of increasing your status and your honor and something like that. But you're able to care about them in themselves. So you learn to look at them in themselves and therefore care for them in themselves. And the intellectual life, I think, for Plato and Augustine, is supposed to do that for you. It's supposed to actually give you a capacity to care for things in themselves and therefore respond to them in themselves, which means, I think, among other things, caring for the city that you're in and therefore caring for the neighbors that you have around you. So, sorry if that was an incredibly long-winded answer.
No, that was great. I think there's something akin to what you're saying here in like Martin Buber, his I Thou, his book I Thou, where we can treat other people as though they're just sort of objects, and then what is like the clichéification of people. We tend to do this in our politically charged kind of discursive landscape, where all we need to know is what side of the fight someone's on, and immediately we've already typecast them. They're the foil or they're the ally. But either way, in either case, we've sort of reduced them to a category, and we've sort of treated them as an object, as opposed to recognizing them as a being with the same kind of complexity and mystery as ourselves. Full of complexity and a view that's not reducible to some political slogan. So I think that the intellectual life, knowledge of the other as a real living person, and not just a thing, and not just an object of our wills to do with as we like. Recognizing them allows us to hopefully love them, recognize them as another self, another I, another a thou, is a way that we can learn to love them.
And if I could just add something very small point to what Jason just said. Again, we have this idea that what the intellectual does is this incredibly rational activity in the sense of its analysis, its definitions, its, stuff of that kind of tribe of activities. But one thing that I think is not talked about enough, which you can find very much in the sources of the tradition, if we can talk that way, is just something as basic as praise. Okay, praise is just so important in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Praise is very important in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, or Nicomachean Ethics, if you prefer, nerds. But the capacity to praise something means that you're not really just interested in what it can do for you, but you're able to see its goodness and respond to its goodness in such a way that you can affirm that it is good and articulate that it is good. And one of my favorite sort of passages in scriptures is sort of the song of the three young men or something, where fire and ice praise the Lord, and all of creation in a way is just singing the song of praise, and which means all of creation itself is sort of capable of praise and therefore kind of wondrous in its own way and should be praised. And yeah, we don't talk about, should we be trying to help people learn how to praise things well as part of liberal education, as part of the intellectual life? And my answer would be yes, if we're sort of in more that sort of classical mode. And so it's not just about thinking about stuff, but being able to sing about stuff appropriately, being able to praise things well. That actually is an amazing intellectual achievement, but it's not the kind of intellectual achievement that a lot of us are thinking about when we think about that brainy thing that intellectuals do. And praise is obviously tied also into the question of love and loving others, because in a way, we praise the dignity of the neighbor when we sort of respond to him appropriately and we love him and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And Kevin, I think we should probably talk about the beatific vision at some point, right? Love and knowledge and the beatific vision.
Yes. Okay, might get us in trouble. Well, the question here is because I think for a lot of us, the beatific vision, and maybe this is not, maybe you're not one of these us, but the beatific vision is something that acts as a kind of paradigm for how we think about the intellectual life. But then there's also like a reverse thing where how we think about the intellectual life might actually inform what we think of the beatific vision. The only sort of thing I want to maybe open up and then hear what Jason has to say about this is, again, the different kinds of visions that we get are kind of different. So I'm teaching freshman philosophy right now, and my class did Thomas Aquinas's Treatise on Happiness. And in one section, Thomas wants to say, hey, do you need friends in heaven? And being a good philosopher, he says, no, because guess what? You just need the vision of God. But if you have friends, that's cool too. And if there are any Thomists who are being offended and harmed by my summary, I'm sorry. But that's the gist of what he says. But so you almost get this sense that, yeah, all you kind of need to do there is gaze upon God. Mm-hmm. And this gets articulated in imagery much more significantly in Dante, right? So Dante's Paradiso, right? Once you get the Empyrean, that giant rose at the end, it kind of looks like one giant sun tanning salon or something, that all the saints are just arrayed and arrayed and arrayed, and God is in the middle, kind of, but not really, he's everywhere. And they're just taking it in. And as you read the Commedia, you notice that the body kind of has less and less to do. In the Inferno, the body is really important. You're continually being told how when the resurrection of the body happens, the experience of hell is going to change. When you get to the Purgatorio, there's that attempt for Dante to sort of embrace his friend, which is like a throwback to Virgil and Homer, and he can't embrace his friend. But the bodiliness, right, the sadness not being able to embrace is nevertheless underlined for us. And then we get to the Paradiso, and it's this, and we've kind of thinned it out, actually, as the poem goes, that the bodiliness of the poem actually gets thinned out in an interesting way, which I think is maybe one of the weaknesses of Paradiso, maybe one of the reasons people don't like Paradiso as much as, say, Purgatorio and Inferno. And so the question then becomes, yeah, does the body affect contemplation? What's the point of the body in the beatific vision? Are there embodied ways of contemplating? These are the questions that come up, especially if you're going to believe in things like the final resurrection. And so the Dantean and Thomistic picture, based at least on the Treatise on Happiness, I think is kind of it's a little handicapped. If it's going to be the model by which we try and understand the beatific vision, the intellectual life, whereas the Book of Revelation, at least, seems way wilder. Mm-hmm. And you have a city, so it's organized in various interesting ways, and it's a city kind of doing liturgical action. So all of a sudden, what is intellectual is not purely the intellect, but is embodied, all right? And there's different kinds of things to do and so on and so forth. And I think when C.S. Lewis writes about, the conclusion of Narnia, that's sort of, he's pulling more on that, this idea that, yeah, there's going to have to be running around and doing sorts of things. I don't know if he's right, but at least he's more awake to the problem of the body in heaven. And what are you going to do with it? In a way that maybe Augustine also in the City of God is maybe trying to figure out and play with.
Yeah, to be fair with Thomas and the Thomists, I think they all recognize the difficulty there.
Yeah.
That Thomas has been saying all along, that what it is to be human is to be bodily and spiritual. We're an amphibious creature that lives at the horizon or the threshold of angels and material things. Part of a part that is immaterial, part intellectual, and a part that's bodily and animal. Yeah. But then at the same time, he does admit that it's possible, and that people, separated souls, can enjoy the beatific vision.
Right.
Separated souls in isolation from their community can enjoy the beatific vision. it does seem to follow from everything that, he says about the nature of the soul. It does seem to follow from, it's consistent with his broader philosophy about what, happiness consists in the attainment of God, and God is the good in which we find perfect satisfaction and peace, perfect enjoyment, making all other goods sort of superfluous. And so you sort of have to say, yes, we can enjoy the beatific vision without our bodies and without our communities and just all by ourselves. And it looks a lot like, the monastic sage just sitting in his cell, contemplating and wishing he did, wasn't burdened by his body, It sort of does look like that, So I think it's a theological problem that a lot of people have been worried about for a long time. Every time I've come across the beatific vision in a doctoral class, it's always treated that way. It's always like, well, where's the body? Where's the community? And then that's another point I think that we sort of haven't discussed too much yet, but I think it's crucial. Human beings are communally intelligent. We don't live the intellectual life as individuals. Like, and there's several ways to kind of cash this out, but people like John Henry Newman and John Paul II too, that come to mind, have emphasized the way in which human knowing and human believing is this communal enterprise. Like 99% of the things that we think about the world around us are things that have been delivered to us. This is Augustine too, actually. Like, the story of your own birth is something that you just accept on faith. We have a communal approach to our intellectual life, and if the beatific vision is in some sense, the intellectual life par excellence, if it's, then surely that should be reflected in some way in the beatific vision. But I love your point about the revelation giving us this image of a beatific vision that is corporate, and it's liturgical and political. It's wonderful.
It's really striking. I mean, I don't know how much trouble I'm trying to get in one afternoon, but I suspect, and this is because I've been reading a lot of Edith Stein for one of my classes, one of my seminars. So this is suspect. I am very much open to being corrected and recognizing my wrongness, and I'm willing to learn and unlearn and do the work, etc., etc. But she talks about it in an interesting way about how the human species is a unit of a kind. And I think she's partly playing with the idea of, obviously, the church also is this corporate individual, like the bride of Christ or something. But she's going to play with the human beings as a species, and so they have a kind of unity, a corporate unity that clearly angels presumably don't have, if we believe the usual scholastic song and dance about that. But if that's right, so she kind of raises, among other things, that you therefore need the male and the female, for example, to kind of get the proper relationship, to understand what humanity actually is. You need the male and the female, which might mean you need male and female contemplation, among other things. But if you take the species as a whole, there's a way in which, for humanity to contemplate God correctly, we have to do it corporately. And not just individually, the way, in a set analogous way that the angels might. Obviously, they don't, because any number of things. But this idea that human beings really need corporate or communal contemplation. Mm-hmm. And there's interesting kind of paradigms for that, let's say. So the obvious one in my mind is, there's a divine one. You're going to get so much Plato today, is Plato's Phaedrus, right? So the gods, in the Phaedrus, we don't get one demiurge, but we get 12 divinities. And they are all also in a kind of liturgical sort of dance around the forms or around the good. And so you get these 12 gods all together, contemplating together. And that's kind of interesting. And then the other Platonic image, obviously, is a symposium, right? That, again, it's not this idea that here I am in my cell, or here I am on top of this mountain, just waiting for, as it were, the good to dawn upon me. But that conversation of the symposium, or the conversation of the Phaedo for that matter, highlights how human beings need this give and take, that they are perfected by being able to engage the perspectives or the views of other people who are in this rational activity with them. Yeah. And so once again, that solitariness question kind of there's an asterisk put on it, right? Augustine himself plays with this in the Confessions. Book 7, I think, he attempts a Neoplatonic ascent. He's not virtuous enough to do it, so that's a significant point. But he describes being kind of beaten down or being repulsed by God when he tries to do the sort of solo Neoplatonic ascent. But then book 9, I think, when he's in Ostia with Monica, shortly before she dies, I guess, they perform an ascent together. Right. And in the paragraph where he describes that, he's continually underlining, that this is it's a plural pronoun. We this, we saw this, we did this, we touched. And the touch thing is interesting, right? The image of corporeality he kind of sprinkles in his idea of contemplation. Yeah, so Augustine is clearly aware of this and thinking about this, and there's something more proper maybe in kind of doing this with someone else, which you also find in the Phaedrus, that the lovers, or the love and the beloved, sort of ascend together, which is different than other kind of Platonic images that you get elsewhere. So yeah, we don't talk enough about the kind of corporate angle of contemplation, or the friendship aspect of contemplation, and we should.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's look at a couple more of these questions. We only have more here, but Michael Takik gave a suggestion. The schools of the world should enhance education and reason and ethics, seeds for intellectual growth. Perhaps a good place to start. He links his paper there. From Fritz Heinzen, hasn't a positive development been the opening of trade bookstore shelves to academic books starting in the late 1980s, combined with university presses developing trade lines and imprints, e.g. the University of Nebraska Press, which has an older trade-oriented reprint in type. Wow, this is a lot of information here. Imprint titled Bison Books, purchased by Potomac Books. You must be in the publishing industry, Fritz.
Yeah.
I, as another person from the publishing industry, agree with that sentiment entirely. I do think that often the distinction between an academic book and a trade book is artificial. I think that one of the things that we try to do at Word on Fire Academic is blur the line a bit, and we realize that a lot of our books are perfectly edifying for what we call the general audience reader, the non-specialist. There's a time and place and a need for books that are specialist, specialist oriented. But I think in general, we keep a lot of, great readers away from very edifying stuff just by putting the wrong label on it. Right. And this is just the sort of elitism of some of the prevailing, conceptions of the intellectual life and the intellectual figure.
And that is, I think, all true. And thank you, Mr. Heinzen, for your point. I am actually going to take a small shot at academics, because there's just so much stuff out there of very questionable value. And I think that's something that, again, there's this sort of fixation and maybe even a kind of idolatry when it comes to writing and the intellectual life that is maybe a little unhealthy, because it makes people produce and write so much. Part of it is just the corruptions of academia itself, right? I am compelled to do a fair amount of writing, which I might not be entirely keen on, but it's necessary for me to keep my job and so on and so forth. So you have that kind of corrupt perversion of its own. But I am going to say, because, maybe we'll not get back to this point, outside of academic books and outside of even trade books, let's say, we should actually expand to, say, poetry, broadly understood. So whether we're talking about fiction or, prose fiction or poetry, that should be an important part of people's intellectual life, right? We're not just kind of reading about theories all day, because theories are incredibly restrictive. I mean, my dissertation director would continually try and remind me that philosophers are reductionist, that in their attempt to neatly define and describe, they often let out a lot of important things, important true things. So just to give a kind of clear example, I would much rather read, though this is maybe I'm cheating slightly, but this will be helpful. I'd much rather read Carol Hauslander's kind of description and autobiography of her psychology, or read Shakespearean sonnets to learn about psychology, than to read the vast majority of philosophical psychology. Because either the autobiographical writer or the really good poet are much better at understanding what is going on with intention and attention and memory and desire and hope and ambition and so on and so forth than some kind of treatise or something like that. So yes, generally it is a positive development, yeah. But if you're going to sort of put together an intellectual life, you really need to carve out a big space, I think, for poetry, for art, for, you know, stuff of that kind.
Well, that brings us to the next question, which is about Crawford. Matthew Crawford argues, this is from Dwayne Bruce, Matthew Crawford argues in Shop Class of Soulcraft that the intellectual life as it is typically lived ignores our embodied condition, the truth that we have bodies as well as minds. The wisest intellectuals use their hands as well as their minds. Take Wendell Berry, for example, a formidable intellectual who also cuts brush and tends to farm animals.
Yes, this is clearly of the genre of more a comment than a question, which is fine. And that's exactly right. And classically speaking, right, I mean, Plato is famously a wrestler. Socrates has done military tour of duty that Alcibiades mentions. That in the classical mode, clearly these people were not just sitting around thinking continually, and that's sort of all there was to it, but they lived way more varied and embodied ways of living. And it's no surprise to me, at least, that Socrates goes to the craftsman, right, for trying to figure out, is there wisdom there? Because I think one of the readings of that is, oh yeah, he's so conceited. But no, I think he's sort of realizing that good craftsmen have a kind of wisdom. Unfortunately, they may not be able to articulate it in the way that a philosopher might need in words, okay? But there's clearly a practicality and a wisdom that they have that a lot of ideas people often don't have, right? Especially sort of intellectuals who get caught up in their ideas, and these are not ideas that are actually realizable in a humane, in an anthropological or politically healthy way. You find less of that, I think, with people who are sort of, right, serious and good craftsmen and artists. Artists are a little just more tricky because often there is that Baudelairean thing of the tortured inspiration that might be madness. So you have that angle, which is like, I maybe don't need to kind of raise, but to the bigger point of, yes, people did things with their bodies. The training in the Republic is physical as well as musical. Xenophon is going to talk about horsemanship as an important part of what we would call a liberal education. Yeah, it's not, you know, brains in a meat suit doing intellectual things, but it's a human person doing intellectual things. That means being properly, it means our cognition is embodied ultimately, and our understanding is embodied. So yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I find that a lot of times when you read stories of great saints, they have a kind of wisdom, and I think it's not a coincidence that Therese of Lisieux is considered a doctor of the church, even though she's not, you know, in a way she probably wouldn't fit the mold of an intellectual, but you know, they have a connection to the world. They're not just in books. They have a healthy sort of embodied existence, and they're learning not just from books, but they're learning from the book of creation, the natural order, from their experiences in the world. And a lot of times it's with animals. There's a proverb, I think, that says, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, and consider her ways and be wise." You can just learn so much by watching things. But again, this is it presumes that we're actually out there watching and
Yeah.
paying attention. And I think that one of the things that urban life tends to do is it sort of closes us off to, there's some of the most extraordinary experiences that we would naturally have in the ancient world. They couldn't help but have, like, for instance, the night sky.
Mm-hmm.
When was the last time you saw the night sky in all of its magnificence? I've seen it a couple of times in my life, out in the Outer Banks in North Carolina, super far away from any polluting cities. You just see this cosmos above your head, and it's the most extraordinary thing. You can't help but wonder at that. It's sort of like the beatific vision, it captured if you want to be captured or not.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I will just add one small element to the physicality thing as well, which is something that animals do, and clearly young humans do, and in some ways adult humans do, but in funny ways, is this sort of the aspect of play, that the body is kind of so well, it invites play in interesting ways. And again, this is not something that gets talked about as much when people deal in conversations in the intellectual life, but it's again something that is sprinkled, at least in the kind of text that I play with. Oh gosh, no, I said that I deal with. So Aristophanes's Frogs, for example, one of the chorus it's about to give a narration. It says, and I'm going to give a narration that is going to balance the serious things and the comedic things. Plato at the end of the Symposium has Socrates say, the best writers are those who can sort of combine the comic and the tragic. And Xenophon at the beginning of his Symposium says something along the lines of, it's good to know what great people do, not only in their serious moments, but also in their lighthearted moments. What's usually translated as lighthearted, but it's really in their moments of play. And that's sort of the opening for explaining the symposium he's going to kind of give us. And the symposium is incredible. Both symposia, Xenophon's and Plato, are incredibly bodily. And I think there's this idea, the idea that we sort of need to kind of hang on to somewhat is, it's not all this serious stuff. That to be able to actually reason well and reason humanely, we have to also develop this element of play and humor and the comic and so on and so forth in our communities, because playing alone is maybe not possible. I'm not sure about that, but
Or healthy.
probably, yeah. And so it's so it combines the communal aspect, the bodily aspect, and informs intellectual activity in a way. This idea of play, which I think is kind of, again, really cool. We don't really sort of stress very often when we're talking about, look at us, serious academics, thinking about serious things. You can talk about serious things in ways that are playful. And I think something Socrates or Plato appreciate, and the saints appreciate too, very clearly. At least we know, let's put Benedict aside, but the rest of them.
Right. Well, we probably should wrap it up. I think we're supposed to end this at 1. And
okay.
So, but let's get to some of these last questions. We've got David Duez says, wouldn't the intellectual be more enjoyable and productive if they engage with not just lecture 2, a wider portion of the public? I feel like you might be talking about us.
Yeah, I'm feeling very, I'm being called out right now.
Yeah, no, that's a good thing.
And yes, actually, my answer to that very briefly is yes. And this is something that maybe we did not get to, but ways in which, again, the intellectual life is expanded, and this is just a point from Joseph Pieper, is festival. That communal festival, political festival. And that is a space in which there's a sort of corporate kind of anamnesis or recollection. There's a corporate kind of contemplation that's going on that is not very heady, doesn't need to be very heady. But even within festivals, I mean, I think people like having, as it were, intellectuals show up and give, little, conversations or open houses or treatments of what is the thing that we are in fact celebrating and so on and so forth. And I think that's kind of cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of role for the intellectual, the public intellectual in
Yeah.
fostering the intellectual life of ordinary people. And I do think that the answer is not to just democratize, the scholarship to the point where it doesn't exist anymore. You know what I mean? It does. It's not that we do need our Socrates figure. We need our gadflies to provoke us and to question us, to challenge us, and to spur us to question and challenge ourselves too. So I do think that there is an intellectual, but that's not to be identified with the intellectual life. And the intellectual, I think, does have a sort of role as, there's a sort of prophetic or pedagogical role of a kind of specialized, gadfly type intellectual. And I wouldn't want to just reduce intellectuals to just being one other sort of person in the crowd, so to speak. I do think that they have to have, in virtue of what they do, they have to have, and they should have, if they're doing their job, they should have a role in the public. And again, it's not just about like lecturing to people, but engaging with people in the way, the Socratic method. It's not a simple monologue, it's a dialogue. And I think, so I think that's important. We should probably move on to this last, we just got one. And we got a couple comments. Thank you so much, Fritz. Appreciate your comments and your support of Word on Fire. Marcella Duque said, I often think of something I heard from a friend. Half the time, what people who want to get a PhD really want is to live in the Republic of Letters. They want an intense intellectual community and think that they can only buy it in this way. I'm wondering if you think this is a wrong reason for pursuing a PhD, and in what other ways would you suggest someone to pursue an intellectual life if they can't find a community outside the university? And we said community is essential. Great question.
Yeah. Okay, so to the first part, I think that is, I understand the impulse. I can't quite say that was my motivation. I think it's a risky thing because for a couple of reasons. First, because just generally speaking, PhD programs are just so different and so specialized. So I've had any number of people kind of talk about ways in which, I came in wanting to study X and that guy does Y and not X. And actually there isn't that much for us to kind of share. And that's a risk of many departments, generally, I think at the PhD level.
If you are not somewhat disillusioned, then I want to know what program you took.
And then there's just the amazing grind of a PhD program. I think undergrad is the place where you probably get something closer to healthy intellectual curiosity, whereas grad school is this ridiculous scholarly grind. And because you're trying to kind of get that sort of certificate saying, I can do research too. And it's just a very different shape. You're not kind of having those late night conversations with your dorm friends because you're probably living not with the people that you're in school with. For a lot of people, you might have a wife and child and so on and so on, husband and child and so on. So these sorts of things mean grad school just tends to be way rougher space. So I would say it's not a bad reason necessarily. I think it's a risky thing because the odds of you being disillusioned outside of a few very special programs, I think, are incredibly high, and dissatisfied and feel like you got cheated. But then you still have this good question of what does one do outside of the university? And there just might be the tragedy of life, and they're outside of online communities. That seems to be way more of a thing that's happening these days, and that's kind of cool. But I guess they're obviously not ideal. It's better to be in person. So that's maybe the second best that is available to many people. the ideal, which obviously is not going to be available to all people. I'm saying this because I'm now in Irving. I mean, I've lived in one very small city. And so the academics were kind of close, and the academic adjacent people were sort of close to them. So that was helpful. And then now I'm in a much bigger city, but there's a very strong intellectual community on the peripheries, let's say, of the university. And I'm struck by the number of people who just have little cabals or little groups, and they meet and they read and they talk. So I've met, at least in Irving, I've only been here like a couple of months, and there's a mom's reading group, because a bunch of young women, and we were like, we can't just be talking about poopy diapers all the time. I care about my kids' poopy diapers. I don't care about your kids' poopy diapers. So let's talk about something that we all share. And so there's a mom's reading group that a couple of my friends are in. There's a Friends of Jane Austen reading group that another of my friends is in. There's a family who are sort of like a clan in the area. They have their own reading group. Obviously, there's the Readers of First Things, the Rofters group. So I think you just have to try and figure out, where do you find these people? Now, it's kind of sad in the sense it's just as bad as dating. Where do you find these people? And you go to, what are your natural communities, right? And maybe within your natural communities, whether it's church or work or sports or whatever, you try and find those people who are also intellectually interested. And then you sort of form this other group with them, is what I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I think the community is essential. You have to make it. You have to either make it or join it. Look into your local university, see if there's anything going on there. Organizations like the Institute for Human Ecology are terrific. There's Institute for Human Ecology has got like a gravitational pull, and it draws in not just scholars, but people in a lot of different ambits, a lot of different kind of disciplines in academia together, and it creates a kind of great ecology, a flourishing little ecology. And I think they have a lot of free events. So if you're in the DC area, definitely go to those. But it's a great moment for scholarly communities right now. I think they're just everywhere. Word on Fire's got a lot. We've got the Institute. You can join the Institute and be, get access to all these great videos, and also be part of a community that we're trying to foster local communities. But yeah, the long and the short of it, you simply can't make it alone. I think that, there are places where it feels like it's an intellectual wasteland, and there's nobody who wants to talk about a book or anything like that. Well, your intellectual life will languish there, and you need to find a community. And that, honestly, part of the reason why I got into academia is because I wanted to find a community. I'm not going to lie. I did want to be part of that Republic of Letters myself. And sometimes it's hard to find. It is hard to find, but like Kevin was saying, create it and find it, but don't just sort of go it alone. That's not the way to do it. Lastly, we have a comment from an anonymous attendee. The person living a life according to their vocation, which may not be necessarily an intellectual life, i.e. a stay-at-home mom, are sincerely grateful for intellectuals who open opportunities to participate in mini festivals like this. Thank you for sharing the invitation to an intellectual life through events like this. Thank you so much for your comment, anonymous attendee. That's very encouraging. I appreciate that.
Thank you. And I guess that means we are therefore officially intellectuals, for good or for ill.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed chatting with you, Kevin, and I want to thank all of the listeners who participated and submitted these terrific questions. I feel personally enriched to have been able to chat with you all, and I hope to do this again.
And likewise, thank you very much. And if you're ever in Dallas, and look us up, we're happy to kind of have fun at UD with the people.
Absolutely. All right. Well, God bless.
Take care.